Hi, everybody. How you doing today? My name is Rick Alling, and I want to welcome everybody to our version of Virtual Night Sky tonight. We made it till the end of July. I think we've seen the peak in the hottest days of the summer, and we're going to start to see the cooling off, punctuated by some of the thunderstorms that have been rolling through. These are the sort of the days and the thunderstorms I remember from my childhood years and years ago. This is the way it's supposed to be. Lots and lots of rain and dramatic lightning storms, and then heat waves in between. And that's what we live with here. And so it affects our stargazing. It affects the way we kind of enjoy the night sky. But we've got some things coming up. We'll tell you at the end of the show some things to look for as we go into August. I've been looking forward to tonight's presentation for a long time. We came up with this idea a couple of months ago. My team at ASU and I, so we try to stay about 2 or 3 months out in programming. And so I'll get to a bigger introduction about what we're going to do tonight in a moment. But let me introduce some of the people that are on board here. Fellow staff members with me are Meg Hufford. She's my colleague, and Meg and I have worked together for how many years, Meg? She's probably muted.
2008.
2008. Okay, she keeps track and I don't. So that's a long time. And so and we actually are in charge of outreach programs for people visiting the school. And so we are all about people coming to see us at ASU. And of course, during COVID, that just didn't happen. And so we really invented this virtual night sky program every other Wednesday as the alternative. You know, what can we do together when we are apart and all this stuff? It's become a very nice success, and people
Rick,
enjoy it. Yes.
Lucky 13. Lucky 13
Oh,
years.
is it 13? Good. Excellent. Good. Kim Baptista, you probably might recognize the name. She's the one that handles the webinar itself and the communication and the logistics and how to keep this thing moving. So she's our webmaster, and I kind of call her the producer because she handles all of those things that sort of have to be done in the background to make a show come across and do a good job. So Kim's with us. We have 2 students here tonight. Alicia Hyatt is with us, and Alex Blanche. They have been with us from the very, very beginning, and so we've got a new school year starting in about 3 weeks, and we'll probably try to bring on some new students. So hopefully you'll meet some new people as we get into August and September and October. But Alex and Alicia have been solid, and you'll see them. They handle some question and answer and some polling, and they have some presentations later in the program tonight. There are some things that I sort of try to remind everybody every time we do this. We are recording this, and this will be available later as a YouTube video on our website. And so we'll try to give you some help finding that in a further communication. We also, we don't have chat, we don't do that. And we also don't have, you can't raise hand, you can't do that. But we do actually still have a way to talk to you, or you have a way to talk to us. So in the bottom of your screen, there's a question and answer button. And please just go ahead and feel free to use it. If there's something strikes you along the way, if you want to just push that button, kind of type in a real question. Alicia and Alex are reading that and kind of watching that in the background. And so they'll bring questions forward at the appropriate moments of the program when it seems fitting to do so. So there will be ways to do that. We have a closed captioning system, and we do that. And there's a way for you to turn it off if you don't like it. You leave it on if you do, but there is a closed captioning button, and you can sort of enable it or disable it on your own. We use it because it makes it easier to produce the YouTube video at the end. And then finally, if you just sort of like up at the top right corner of your screen, you can kind of play with that button about what your view looks like, however you want to do it. I'm hoping you see the presenters and what they're presenting in full screen if you can, and then you might have a little side window where you're watching them or just their names. You could do it a couple of different ways to do. And so I'm just trying to read. Yep. So the closed caption is on, and you can actually disable it if you like. And so let me talk about what we're doing tonight. I put a call out and I invited people from the astronomical community, basically citizen scientists. These are people that have other jobs and do things, but their passion is about astrophotography. Their passion is about astronomical things. There are many clubs and groups in town that support that kind of activity. And so people can get involved in lots of different ways and as deep as you want. I mean, these people, I call them amateurs, but some of them are more serious than the researchers we have at ASU. So it's really, it's an amazing experience if you so choose. And so the idea we came up with for tonight was to feature a thing I'm calling landscape astrophotography. And that means that what we're doing is we're sort of going out in the field, and big cliff faces or canyons, many, you'll see tonight, many recognizable places and some unrecognizable. But it's capturing your earth, it's capturing your landscape, putting you in a place, and then having the sky meet that. So it's the night sky we've been looking at all along for the last year and a half. But now we'll see it in photography, where we have these beautiful night sky images, and they're actually sort of attached to the earth. So there is other astrophotography that takes us into deep space. And we've seen some of that before. We see the nebulas and all that stuff. We're not talking about that tonight. We'll do that at a later program. And this one, we're really kind of specializing on that photography that kind of keeps us attached to the earth and the earth attached to the sky. And that's really where we're going. So in order to do this, we have 4 guests tonight, and they're all we've met with them in the last couple of days, and they all have outstanding examples of their craft, and they're passionate about their craft. And we're going to have presentations and a little conversation, and that's going to take up most of the hour. So I'm just, without any further ado, I'm going to get started, and I'm going to invite somebody. If you've been with us for a long time, you've already met Kevin O'Donnell. Kevin joined us for some other sessions about observing the moon and some other things. And so I'm going to kind of just get Kevin onto the screen, say hello, and let's just start sharing, and let's see what you got. Thank you, Kevin. You can also add to and say a little bit more about yourself if you like. So.
Well, thanks, Rick. I'm a professional digital photographer and videographer in my day job, and so I'm lucky to be able to do that, and then also do the night photography, the astrophotography. So glad that all of you could join us tonight. So I'll share some images that I have. I'm all about variety of shot. So astro landscapes are definitely a big part of my portfolio. Pictured here is my deep sky rig. Rick was talking about deep sky photography. I do that as well. So this is a DSLR camera on a long lens with a star tracker and a small guider.
And a sandbag, if I get that correct, right?
Sandbags are very important.
Okay.
But besides deep sky objects, I just like being able to shoot everything from the Milky Way landscapes on a tripod to handheld bursts of the International Space Station flying over at 17,000 miles per hour. So that's pictured over here on the right side.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so I'm first and foremost, I'm a photographer, and I actually don't even own a telescope. I'm also working on a video. So these examples many times are single exposures. I'll just throw that out there. And they're framed for video, so not really meant for large prints as maybe some other speakers might have. So for me, it's all about video and sort of web quality. You just have to decide what's for you. So I'll start with this photo because I like it a lot. And it's an example of a composite. So I'm going to talk about the difference real quick about a composite versus a stack. So a stack is when you take a bunch of photos with sort of the same exposure, and then you use computer software that registers, it aligns the stars, and then it removes a lot of noise. So the more photos that you take, the more differences in the noise are in the photos that it can then remove. And it results in a cleaner image. So the more, the better. And then a composite is different. And this is an example of both, actually. A composite is when you shoot something in the foreground, in this case, Bell Rock and Courthouse Butte, and then you take a long exposure of that. So this is a 5-minute exposure in the front, and that where more light is captured, but 5 minutes would blur the stars. So I did a stack in the background of 10 photos that were only about 20 seconds each. Now this is my vortex. So if you want trails, you want star trails, that's something people look for and try to get, you take a lot of photos, and if you line yourself up with Polaris or the North Star, that's where all of the stars will be rotating around in the sky. So this is 100 pictures, and then you use the software to composite those. So here's some more examples of this. I'm going to blaze through a lot of these because I have a lot of examples tonight. So this is just a little bit off to the right of Polaris, and you get that cool rising effect of the stars that complements the church here up in Sedona. Here's another example where I could see where Polaris was. I found it, and I lined it up with the pillar here at Garden of the Gods in Colorado Springs. So that's a great technique too. If you can find something where you want to line it up with the Polaris, you get some great results that way. When I was also in Colorado Springs, I went to the Overlook and took some photos at the Pikes Peak Overlook. This is an example, if you're curious what you can do if you can only take 20 minutes. This was 20 minutes before they closed the park. So that's about what you get. This kind of look almost like a meteor showers in the sky. It's a great look. So moving on from sort of the star fields and so on, this is just a photo at Watson Lake. I encourage people to go to Watson Lake. It's beautiful. It's actually free on Wednesdays. I'll throw that little piece of information out there. So it doesn't cost anything to go there on Wednesdays, but they do close at 10 o'clock. So be aware. And then this is a shot of desert view at the south rim of the Grand Canyon. So that's actually moonlight on the tower, believe it or not. Milky Way shots are what everybody loves. So here's one of my favorites. It's Buttercup Sand Dunes near Yuma. So if any of you have driven to San Diego or back or not are from the area, this is fairly dark. It's not as dark as I expected actually, but that's the Milky Way over the sand dunes that are famous in the Star Wars movies. Some of the Sarlacc sand pits are actually supposed to be located out there.
Kevin, I'm surprised you got this without sand buggies, and because they drive all night long, and so
and
I
border patrol and everything else. So
okay,
stuff going on over there, believe it or not. Another one of the Milky Way, again, really popular. This is Navajo Bridge. So this is the bridge where you can cross over the Grand Canyon. It's Marble Canyon, so it's sort of the start of the Grand Canyon. This is the Salt River, so also in the Phoenix area. This is a little brighter than I thought, actually. You get there, you think it's going to be pretty dark. The sun goes down, and there's a lot of light pollution, even in a remote place like this. This is up at Marble Canyon as well. This is called Lee's Ferry, and they had a trading post. I just put some accent lighting on there. And this is just a single exposure again. So just one, 25-second exposure, and you can get something like this to work with. And then this is kind of like my highlight of that before I talk about some of the math. And this was taken in Flagstaff. So Flagstaff's where I get the darkest skies. And this was last August. So it's this time of year again to do this kind of thing. So what I'd like to point out is sort of composition a bit. If possible, you'd like to get something in your foreground, your middle ground, and your background. So I had this happy little tree that was in the foreground that I really liked. I was very pleased that someone happened to be on the other side of the lake with a campfire. I think that's extremely rare. I've never even seen it since, so I was lucky with that. And then a beautiful clear night, and you can actually see Jupiter and Saturn up there if you see to the left of the galactic core is what they call this of the Milky Way. And so a couple of things. People will talk about this lately because it's a fairly new concept, and it's the Bortle area that you live in, or what kind of light pollution is available. So in 2001, John Bortle created this scale, with 1 being the darkest skies on Earth and 9 being a brightly lit inner city. So for instance, the shot on the left is from my backyard, and the shot on the right is from Flagstaff. And I tried to frame them about the same. If you look carefully, you can see both Jupiter and Saturn here, and the stars line up otherwise. But as you can see, you really need to get away from the city if you're going to get some great deep sky shots, because there's a huge difference, I hope you can all see, between the two. And this lucky plane, of course, because there's so much plane traffic in the Phoenix area. So if you're kind of wondering like where dark skies are, there's some apps for that. I'm not promoting anything in particular, but this app on the left shows you sort of light pollution areas. It's a light pollution map, so you can kind of see where to drive.
Look at Phoenix and Mesa. It's like, oh my God, red zone.
I go out quite a ways, but there's, it's not far. I mean, you can go in any direction, you can find stuff. And then I like some of these other apps. Again, I'm not promoting any particular, but there's ones that can tell you how much darkness you'll have that night, how to find objects in the sky, the ISS flying over, and some transits. And then I use polar alignment. So now on that point, here's a couple of things you definitely need, because people ask me this a lot. So I just figured I'd throw some of this out there. As Rick pointed out, sandbags are a must, right? So I have a sturdy tripod. I have put some sandbags on there. It keeps things from moving. It's also important to have something that's called an intervalometer, because you don't want to be pressing the shutter button. You want to be able to remotely control that. If you don't own one, or you don't want to purchase one, an alternative is what's called an interval timer. It's built in a lot of the cameras out there. So you can set it up to do a routine and not have to touch the shutter. And then another trick I found is, I always wondered what that 2-second timer was on the camera. If you guys have digital cameras, you're like, what is a 2-second timer good for? Well, I figured out that if you set it to 2 separate timer and then you hit the shutter button, it gives it a moment for the camera to relax, and then it takes a picture on its own. So it's kind of a little clever trick if you feel like every one of your pictures is a little blurry because you're hitting the shutter button. And then I'd like to talk about the 500 rule for just a moment, because this is very helpful when you're trying to figure out how long of exposures you can take. As you can see, the stars are kind of blurring here, but they aren't in this next shot. It's because of the math. So what it says is basically, if you take 500 and you divide it by whatever focal length you're using, that's the maximum time you should shoot before you're going to get some star blur. This is besides using any sort of tracking devices. So for instance, simple math, if you had a 50mm lens, you only want to take 10 seconds maximum, or you're going to get to start to get some trailing. But the caveat to that is, though, even though the math states that I have a 14mm lens and I can shoot for 36 seconds, since I'm shooting on what's called a crop sensor instead of a full frame sensor, I really have to divide that by another 1.5, which gives me only 24 seconds. And if I zoom in at all, then I may even have to go less. And some people even recommend something called the 300 rule. So that would only give me 14 seconds. So you just have to do your research on the lenses if you want those longer exposures. So here's some other options. You get into a place, you're not getting enough light. What are some other options, Kevin? Well, ISO, you can go up a bit on your ISO to increase that. I wouldn't go above 2000 though, it definitely becomes an issue. Capture a stack whenever possible, so the more the merrier, take as many pictures as you can. And then if you can use a star tracker, that will allow you to track the stars in the sky. However, it will make your foreground blurry now because it's tracking the stars, so keep that in mind. And if you can, buy a lens that has a lower f-stop. I know that costs more money usually, but a lower f-stop means you can let more light in with less length of exposures. And then lastly, on that point, I always try to, whenever possible, make lemonade from lemons, right? You go out there, you have all the right intentions, but you have to embrace that there's going to be clouds and wind and the haze and smoke and planes and the traffic and the city lights. And I just say, Mother Nature doesn't care about your astrophotography, so keep that in mind. And this is what you get when you don't have those conditions, but again, you're doing with what you have. So in La Jolla here, it was cloudy and I took a night shot. There's been a lot of monsoon storms lately, so lightning, and I was able to line this up with a light outside. The moon, got to give some love to the moon. I know it's not great for those deep sky shots and Milky Way shots, but you can do some pretty interesting things with the moon as well. And then, you might go out of town, spend some money on a trip, and then find it to be cloudy. So I took this from the top of the London Eye. Of course, it's going to be cloudy. It's London. But I did something called a tilt shift effect. So what I did in post is I just took the photo and I blurred the top and the bottom. And it gives this appearance like it's a miniature. So it's almost like a toy. And I love that effect. And I thought, what would happen if I applied that to sort of my Milky Way shots? So this is what that looks like. So the left is the galactic core, a wide shot of the Milky Way actually, and the right is also a fairly wide shot of the Milky Way straight up. And because I put that tilt shift effect on the top and bottom, to me, it really almost looks like you're looking at granite up close, or like the pavement. So it's kind of an interesting effect. So just some final thoughts, buy a big fast hard drive if you can. These files can get really big. Capture all the images in RAW format if possible, because you have a lot more you can work with. Take as many pictures as the time allows. Give yourself enough time for that. Take multiple exposures. Like I said, you can do some compositing, and just be prepared for the time, and really the time even more than the money. And I say just enjoy the sights and sounds. Sometimes I go places I can hear wild coyotes. It's really interesting. Just don't forget to look up. And the worst that would happen is you take a picture like this, and because you took like 500 of them, you'll get a shooting star in your shot. But even if you don't get that, you can always make this out of the photo because you have so many that you took. So I have a handle on YouTube. I'm working on this video, and I'm called The Sky Detective. So feel free to look me up if you want. I'll pass it back to the group.
Kevin, that was great. Absolutely brilliant. I love this. So, and you started out saying that you just like to take a whole range of things, and that presentation shows it. I mean, that's everything was in there, and it was all sort of related to the subject. I think it's incredible. So good to have you on again. And if you don't mind, hang around. I'm going to say this to all the presenters till the end, because we have the ability to do that. I will have some questions and stuff. So I was going to ask Alicia and Alex, did anybody have any questions that are specific to Kevin? Is there anything we can take from the audience today, or at this moment, and then we'll move on?
We don't
Okay.
seem to have any questions at the moment, but we'll keep an eye on them.
Let me make a plug again. So if you guys sort of if everybody watching, you see that little Q&A button at the bottom. If one of these presenters says something you need a little clarification on, or you want to make a comment about it, please go ahead and just dump it in there. We'll capture them at the end. I'm going to just move right on. I'm going to introduce our next presenter is Dennis Young. I met Dennis for the very first time, I think last Friday, and so I had no idea. I mean, Dennis actually, I'll let you tell a little bit about yourself. But coming to know him a little bit, he's been into this for a long time, for decades, and maybe he'll share with us when he actually started taking nighttime photography. But what you're about to see is a presentation, and all of this is not digital photography. All of this is emulsion photography, the old film kind of cameras. And so, Dennis, take it away. Let's see what you got.
Okay. Thank you, Rick. Welcome, everybody. And as he had noted, this is actually before the digital era. I wish I could have done it in digital, but I was working with what I had. And basically, it was a 35mm camera, nothing special, but just that time release, that time elapse where you can use the shutter to have it open for many minutes. So everything's all in minutes. And my very first shot was of the famous coffee pot rock in Sedona. This was a 7-minute long exposure. I was informed by the Tucson Club that this particular Comet Yakutaki, was going to be right next to the North Star, which is just above it and to the right. And I figured, well, I'll try my hand at this. And I used the city of Sedona behind me to do the illumination of the rock, which is the famous coffee pot or the eagle head. The comet actually graced over 3/4 of the sky. It was absolutely spectacular. And certainly I decided to do it again. And an hour later, I went down to Bell Rock, and I have another shot over Bell Rock, same evening.
Same comet, right?
Same comet, same night. And I was very using, again, now this is a different city light. I have 5 different kind of variations of lighting in my work. This is the first one, and that would be city lights. And this was the Village Bow Creek behind me that did the illumination. This is about another 6 to 7 minute long exposure, again with the North Star directly above it, right in the middle, and that's where everything spirals around. My next shot here is the famous Cathedral Rock, and this is my second type of lighting. This is done by Moonlight. This is all my work I was trying to do was to be natural. You know, nothing done to the negative, all untouched, no double exposures. And that was my forte of when I was going into this particular field. When I was shooting Hale Pop, believe it or not, I worked out the numbers. I traveled over 4,000 miles and never left the state of Arizona just for Comet Hale Pop. It was visible for 3 or 4 months, and I shot literally about every night, traveling 100 and some miles north and about 80 miles south of where I lived in Sedona. As a local in Sedona, I've been there for 35 years, and the sky just opens up when you come to some dark places like that. Of course, the Milky Way is kind of softly going across the sky with the moon out, and then, of course, that's the famous Hale Bopp on the left. And next shot, I went, of course, closer to Phoenix, and I took a handheld flashlight. Here's my third type of lighting. And I walked up to each one of the cactus and lit them up one by one. This is nothing new. This is what we call painting in the field. And this is basically all self-taught. I never took a photography class. I learned while I was out there. One of the things that I did after I did Yakutaki, when Hale Bopp came around the following year, I decided to get some equipment. That's what Kevin had. And I had some tracking device that I always carried with me. Sometimes I would travel over 3/4 of a mile away from my car. So it was somewhat of an ordeal with 35 pounds of gear in my backpack. This particular one is near Table Mesa, is where I shot this location. And this one is a now tracked item. So this is a time elapsed about 4 minutes. So that's why the stars are relatively clean. And then you notice on the cactus, there's a shadow on the left side. And that's because that's how much the earth moved on the landscape. But the lighting was only 10 seconds. That's why it's a clean look. My next shot, I got a little bit better at the performance of the lighting. And this is a very surreal, as I call it, a surreal cactus shot. Comet was right on the horizon, a little bit of faint clouds overhead. My next one was the famous Cathedral Rock again. Here's my third type of lighting. This is a 1.5 million candle floodlight. I painted the rock from almost a quarter mile away
Oh my
and lit
gosh.
it up myself, which is hundreds of feet across and a couple hundred feet in height. I wanted it to be done by moonlight, but unfortunately there were clouds on the night that the comet was right in the middle of the notch, and I wanted to get that effect. I didn't want to wait another 2,000 years before it came back. My next shot is the famous sunrise shot, I call this. It was done at sunrise. What is somewhat very unique to this photo that is quite apparent, only one half of the entire photo has hundreds of stars in it. The other half is all illumination of the sun and the sunrise. So it's a beautiful transition from day to night. And I thought that was a very beautiful setting there. And of course, the comet is centrally placed in the middle. The next shot is the famous Grand Falls. If anybody knows this part, I've been in multiple places, and some of them are on Indian sacred grounds, and this is one of them. Grand Falls, for those who are not aware of, is north of Flagstaff, about 35 miles. It's almost a 200-foot drop from top to bottom. It's also nicknamed Chocolate Niagara. There are times of the year it actually puts out more water than Niagara Falls, and it's taller than Niagara Falls. But you notice it also has a nickname of Chocolate Falls, has a chocolatey muddy flow. It is the beginning of the Little Colorado River that goes into the Grand Canyon. This is what it looks like by day, and then the next shot is what it looks like by night. And this is done by moonlit. The comet is in the distance again, Hale-Bopp, and it was luckily running at this particular time. Sometimes it is not running, so I captured it while some of the water was running with Hale-Bopp. My next shot is another waterfall. Some of us, I'm sure, are aware of. This is Havasu Falls. This is now my fourth type of lighting. Now, this is done by moonlight, but there's a difference to this. This is done at 1 o'clock in the morning, and this is my longest exposure, and this is a 10-minute exposure. And like Kevin had mentioned, there's often you need to do some type of bracketing. Sometimes you want to shoot 6 minutes, 8 minutes, and 10 minutes, and hopefully one of those long exposures will pull out the detail. The longest exposure did do that. However, this is a reflected moonlight. The waterfall was never in the light of the moon, it was in the shade, and the large cliff that was behind me is what did the illumination. Sun off the moon, moon off of the cliff going into the water is how this was lit. They don't teach you that in photography. Next shot will show that. So the next photo shows it clearly, all in the shade. And you can see the large cliff off in the distance that did the illumination of that. My next shot is a beautiful shot of the famous Bell Rock, I believe. And this is one of another unique shot. I played around with this. I had an unusual thought. I thought that when I'm doing these long exposures, sometimes, especially trying to do it where it's a natural shot, not a double exposure, you can only get so much out of a photo before you get the trailing of the stars, or the other part, the landscape starts to blur. So what I did with this ultra wide camera lens, and this is all done with a 28mm lens, for the first 25 seconds before the blurring takes effect, I had the camera open. After 25 seconds, I put the motor drive on, and now it's tracking for 25 more seconds. And so this is a 1.5 minute exposure, but only 30 seconds of blurring on the rock. A lot of detail for emotion to get that kind of detail overhead, and the rock being relatively clean. The next shot is the famous Bell Rock again, and the city of Sedona is what did the lighting on the clouds, and the city behind me did the lighting on the Bell Rock, which is the village of Oak Creek. 2 city lights did lighting on this one. My next one is the rarity of having northern lights. I have seen them 3 times myself personally in Sedona, and this was one of the rare shots that I did with Aurora Borealis over Bell Rock looking due north. The next one is another year. This last one was in 2003. This is in 2001. And this is my 5th and final lighting. The northern lights is the only thing that lit up the Cathedral Rock. There's no cities around it. There was no moonlight around it. And so the northern lights did the illumination of Cathedral Rock. The northern lights lit up the ground. The northern lights lit up the water in the distance. And then the blue light, it's in the foreground. I used a very small pen light that was given me that day and highlighted the water in front of it because my tripod was in the water, and you can see that large tree off to the left. That was doing the shadowing in the area where I was trying to get the water lit up. So when you see the next photo clearly shows the very tall 20-foot tree. And now you can understand that I'm not even looking north. I'm looking due east, and look at all that red in the sky. That night was very spectacular. It was over 5 hours of lighting. Literally one half the entire sky was red to the naked eye. And I was lucky enough to be out there taking some great shots of it. The next shot, a rarity again, an extremely large fireball. The brightest one I've seen in over 45 years. This is not coming out of the rock. I know it looks like a lightsaber from Star Wars, but this is actually coming from the left side. It went 3/4 of the entire sky. My camera was already set up to looking at Bell Rock, and I opened up the camera in midair. So the fireball is coming from the left going to the right. And I wish it would have speared it and came out on the other side of Bell Rock, but I'll take whatever I can get.
It's amazing.
My next shot, of course, is the famous Milky Way. Not as well as with the digital era, but definitely worthwhile for a film back in the 90s. The famous Bell Rock is on the left, and the courthouse is on the right. This is about a 3-minute long exposure, 3.5 minutes, and that's why you have a little bit of a softness to the rock, but it adds much more of a 3D effect to the landscape in the foreground with the hill bop in the middle.
Dennis, you've also captured the two tails that comets have sometimes. It's very rare to get that in this kind of an image. So
That is
very,
correct.
very distinct. So that's really cool.
The distinction here is the white on the right is what they call the dust tail. That is the direction that the comet is going in space behind it. And then the blue tail is from the sun. So they call it solar wind. And that is the blue ionized colors being lit up by the sun and making that water vapor that gives it that blue tint color to it. So that's the blue tail from the solar wind and the dust tail on the right. I always use the analogy, somebody walking down or on a dirt path and he kicks up dust from behind me or behind that person. The person's going forward, but he has dust behind him. But if there's a 10-mile crosswind, you're also going to have wind blowing off to the right as dust as well. Same scenario with the comet, but on a much bigger scale.
Yeah.
With the comet Yakataki, they found out the tail was almost 300 million miles long. After almost a number of years later, a satellite went through the tail of comet Yakataki almost 2 to 3 years later. It was a very spectacular layout there. My last and final shot is another landmark on Indian Reservation. You might have seen this one. Kind of looks like Bryce. No, this is directly in Arizona. This is just south of Tuba City. It has the same kind of texture as Bryce Canyon. This is what it looks like by day, Coal Mine Canyon, and this is what it looks like by night. This is all moonlit. And that's a moonlit shot with the hail bop in the distance. About 1.5 minute exposure to 2 minutes. That's why you get a little bit of the star trails. But I did capture a beautiful canyon. I wanted to do the Grand Canyon, but the Grand Canyon is just too large. This one is about 5 miles long, a beautiful canyon. Even though it's on Indian Reservation, there are picnic tables. You can do barbecue. It's a beautiful location. I strongly suggest that. Same thing for Grand Falls and same thing for Havasu Falls. But the Havasu, I had to hike a 20-mile round trip.
Dennis,
Thank you very much.
Oh, Dennis, this is absolutely amazing. This is really good, and this is a really good juxtaposition. It's ironic. We didn't plan it this way, but Kevin was showing, Bell Rock and Cathedral Rock, and you're showing them, but you weren't there at the same time, right? You were there 20 or 30 years before Kevin got there to sort of do the same thing. I think it's interesting, and it's almost like the comet was following you around. You just obviously you were sort of like motivated to get out. Wow, those comets are kind of rare, and they don't happen very often. So you obviously sort of like
even though I did it for many, I have people when I brought in the developing lab, they said, boy, you look terrible. Oh, I really feel bad because I was working 8 hours during the day, and then I would be out literally and drive
traveling
2
and
hours,
yeah.
and then 2 hours of photo shooting, and then drive back, and I only got a couple hours of sleep, but I would do it in a light speed minute. It was very majestic and very profound to me to be out there in the middle of nowhere to capture a moment in time.
Excellent.
Thank you
Well,
again for having me.
Thank you, Dennis. And hang around a little bit. I'm going to just move straight on, if that's all right, because we're actually we planned. I mean, we knew we were going to run behind, and we're running a little behind. So and so I'm going to actually announce to the audience. We're actually sort of we just might go past the hour tonight. We usually try to kind of get really close to that 8 o'clock time period. But if you don't mind, we'll probably just have to keep going a little bit because this is great. And I don't want to stop people because they got great stuff going on. Okay. I also met Greg Meyer for the first time in the last couple of days. So this is really kind of fun because I can just like put the call out and say, hey, we're thinking about a show and we're thinking about doing this. And usually I go to the astronomical clubs and, you know, sort of societies and people like that. And a couple of people just answered immediately and said, yep, I'd like to do that. And so Greg, welcome. And so also Dennis had been doing this for decades and was using emulsion film and all of that stuff and sort of did, but you're kind of new to this, right? I mean, kind of tell a story how you got into this.
I'm not new to photography. I've been doing photography since college, but I really like landscape and travel photography. And I love camping and being out in nature. So why not, while you're sleeping, be taking a picture? So, you know, not waste any time. In the last year, I've gotten into deep sky pictures with a telescope, and that's fairly new for me. But kind of self-taught, and let me just share my screen and I'll show you some of my pictures.
All right, you're up.
Okay, this was actually at Badger Creek, just north of Phoenix, and there's a lot going on this time lapse, right? So I just want to tell some of the people watching that it is easy to do this. The first time I saw star pictures, I thought looks really complicated. It's really not. You can get a great picture pretty simply. So the basics are like Dennis said, you need a sturdy tripod, a camera that's not moving, and an intervalometer, which you see hanging on the camera here, helps, but it's not required. So in the upper left, you see the camera taking the picture that you see full screen. So I've got a lot set up down here, telescope, other cameras, and I just set this little camera up on a short tripod and let it run for several hours. And you can see all the jet traffic coming into Phoenix going around. Of course, it's the North Star that I positioned right over the campsite. We're going to come back to that later. This is an older picture, sort of a panorama Milky Way. Again, I'm camping out. Another one, I think this was near a flag, so I'm kind of looking through some trees. It's nice if you put a light in the tent for a few seconds and you can light up the tent.
Yeah, this is what Kevin was talking about also, and I'm seeing how important this is to have something really kind of close for middle and back. And so I see all of those in that image.
Someone else had a picture of this. This is Desert View at the Grand Canyon. I think it must have been late in the year because the Milky Way is almost straight overhead.
You guys are all taking this. You're all going to the same places.
Yeah. Arizona's got some great places.
They do.
This is up near on Navajo land country, and it's the same shot, same tripod, but you can see just by adding a light in the tent, the glow and the pop it gives. I also had my drone, and you can see I did a circle around that rock, which was scary because it was actually pitch black. I could not see that rock. That's been lit up because of the long exposure. It was black, and I was a little nervous about running into the mountain.
So wait a second. So that circle you're tracing a drone? Is that what you just said?
That's a drone flying, and that's the light from the drone as it made a circle.
Oh, very nice. Okay. There's
a lot of photographers that do this, and they're very good at it.
It looks extraterrestrial. So.
Yeah. This was an older shot when I was just getting my feet wet, and it was this is the south rim of the Grand Canyon, looking back at the village, and the village is lit up, and there's the Milky Way core. This was just a couple months ago out at the Superstitions. This is the Elvis Presley church out there. Sedona, favorite spot for me too. This is a single shot, not tracked. And again, it was lit up just by the neighboring lights from the houses, and the church itself has its lights on. This is a couple months ago. This is a panorama of, I think, 4 shots to get this connected together. Cathedral Rock. Now this looks really, at least on my screen, very detailed, and this is a tracked shot of the Milky Way. Someone's talked about that. And it's blended in to a shot taken at the same time, the same spot of the rocks. So it's sort of 2 separate pictures that are blended together.
So it's tracked and composite, right?
Right. It's not really what we call a composite. Composite is usually reserved for pictures that have no relation. They were not taken at the same time. They can be very artificial looking. These are, it's more of a blended shot. Same thing. This is Bell Rock. A shot of Neowise. I think I'll skip this next thing. That's a little video of it. This was Yosemite earlier this year. And just for a little teaching, on the left, you see a single shot, ISO 400, 40 seconds, 3.5 to the 28 millimeter. And I've positioned the North Star directly over the falls. Well, I didn't move it. I moved my camera to make it that way. So that was exposed for the stars. I did another exposure on the right to expose the rock in the waterfall. This was taken at 1 in the morning. So the moon had come out, there's a partial moon, and the moon is lighting up the waterfall, but it's blowing out the stars. Now what's fun is when you combine a bunch of pictures, you get this.
Yeah.
So the foreground's the one shot, and then several pictures of the stars as they move, and you put them together. This is what a star tracker looks like. This is one of them. There's 3 major companies that make different products. This is called a Star Watcher Star Adventurer. You can see the setting on the right side. It's off in that position, but you just turn it to the star. And once it's lined up with the North Star, it rotates the same speed the Earth is turning. So the stars appear not to move. Keeps them. It can run on batteries. And it's a really new handy toy that I've got in the last couple of years. And this is how you can take long exposure to the stars with no blurring. Another example, I was at the Nightscaper conference this year in Kanab, and right near there is the toadstools. So this is a static shot of the foreground, 2-minute exposure of the foreground. But you notice during that 2 minutes, the Milky Way got blurry. So you take another picture of the Milky Way, and the stars are sharp, but the foreground is blurred. You put the 2 together, and you have sharp on the bottom and sharp on the top.
Stunning.
And the nice thing, when you start getting long exposures of the Milky Way, you can start to see the nebula, the red spots in there, which become deep sky objects in other telescope pictures. This is right around the corner from the other shot. Some toadstools with the Milky Way. Now this was lit up with some low light, some low level lighting, it's called. This is the newest thing in this type of photography. You can get very LED lights that light up very dimly. You can hardly tell they're even on. But over a minute exposure, they light up these rocks. It was totally dark back there, and I have the light bouncing off another wall to light up these mushrooms, these hoodoos. This is more what I would call a composite. This does not exist in reality.
Oh, I see. I see what you're saying.
This is a drone shot in the middle of the day of Meteor Crater, Arizona. This was a shot of the mountains near Gallup, New Mexico. And it's the Milky Way taken about the same time put together. And like someone else said about the moon is a great object. This is a superstition. This is 4 peaks. This was a full moon rising. It's taken with a 150 to 600 millimeter zoom lens, Sigma lens on a tripod. That's it rising. This is a single shot.
Wow.
So the sun's going down and the moon's rising. This was the following day I went back out, so things weren't quite in the same position. This is a moon shot. This is taken at 1 in the morning in Yosemite. And that's the moon lighting up El Capitan, and you can see the stars. So I was out there running around all night for 3 nights in a row for 5 hours every night, grabbing shots. And I saw this and just jumped out of the car, took a quick picture. This is in Yosemite. This is the chapel there. Here, the North Star is up into the upper right, and you combine several shots that are about 20 seconds each, and you combine them and you get some star trails. And different programs can make them look like meteors like this, but it's just a program that does that, and it's free. You get free programs. This is Monument Valley.
Oh, wow. This really is a meteor shower.
This is a meteor shower. This is the Perseid meteor shower a few years ago. And again, with the magic of Photoshop, every shot that had a meteor, I'm taking one shot after the other with an intervalometer. It's taking pictures for 2 hours by itself, one after the other. And then you go through and find which ones got meteors and combine those into one shot with a single foreground. Here's a longer, again, you're getting maybe tired of seeing star trails with some jets and satellites. This is Mount Rainier. This is Sedona. It's fun to get in your own pictures. You see the lights of Sedona down below, and the lights of Sedona are lighting up the cliffs. This is Mount Rainier. This is my father-in-law. This was, again, midnight or 1 in the morning. It's freezing cold, and I told him to go out there and hold his light, not to move. He didn't like it. And I had him do it like 4 or 5 times when he was moving. But there you see 2500 ISO, 20 seconds, and you got the Milky Way. You can even see the Andromeda Galaxy showing up in the picture.
Yeah. Excellent.
Badger Creek, you can see I can get kind of complicated. I had 5 cameras going. One's a telescope. On the right, on the ground, you see that short little tripod again. That's set up to get the telescope in the picture with my tent and the North Star right above it. And again, I'll put a light in the tent for 5 seconds and light it up. If you take a bunch of pictures and connect them, you can do this.
That's excellent.
You can take the same set of pictures, combine them, and get this. So you can do a lot with an intervalometer and a camera. You can take a lot of different kind of pictures and they're all the same picture. You just combine them different ways. So I think you're gonna, oops, we're not gonna run it yet.
Oop.
You're gonna run this video.
Yep, we have a little video we're going to take
Yeah.
a look at here real quick. Go ahead.
So if you take all the different pictures, what I like to do is put them to music, and even a bad picture can look good with a little musical drama behind it. It's actually a GoPro. No, this is an SLR, SLR. The next shot is actually a GoPro.
Excellent.
Oh, just one more slide.
Okay.
And this was a,
You'll have to share screen again.
oh, I'm not sharing there. Okay. So this is called the Tree of Life. It's off the Oregon coast. It's a famous landmark. So again, this was me out there 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night, and the moon was starting to rise. So that's the rays coming behind the trees on the horizon. And then I planted a low level light within the trees and then would run back and forth from the camera with a 10-second time delay to get in the picture.
Awesome. Okay. Hey, Greg, thank you very much. Dr. Meyer, I'll call you. That's absolutely amazing. And you know what I've learned from all three of you so far. We have one more, so I'm going to introduce Scott in a minute. But there's a lot of room for creativity. I mean, this isn't just sort of taking a thing. You're actually in the sort of the movies of the camera taking the images and all that stuff. That's really very creative, very innovative, and it's really super cool to see. I mean, it's just, I guess anything you want to try is out there, as long as you kind of master your equipment and you're not afraid to try something. I think that's
right,
absolutely amazing.
Like I said earlier, I did attend this Nightscaper conference in Kanab, Utah a few months ago, and it had the best of the best doing this and teaching their wares and how they do it. And I learned a lot about light painting. Light painting is the new thing.
Yeah, I'm going to look it up. And actually, that's what Dennis was showing, sort of like you to do a long exposure and you kind of run around and sort of like paint things as you're going.
But it does look a little fake, you know, with my flashlight, and it's hard to get it just right. These guys, you can buy the equipment on Amazon, very low level light. It's on the whole time. You're not flashing anything, but the light is so dialed down low. It's like moonlight lighting up your object. And yeah, it's great.
It's awesome. Phil, thank you. So I'm gonna move fast. So I'm gonna sort of just hang around because we'll pick up some questions at the end. But I do want to introduce our last presenter. So so Scott Adams is next, and thanks for hanging around, Scott. This is great. And you guys, everybody that has been watching this program for long enough knows that we've been actually sort of like kind of highlighting it. So what's going on in Fountain Hills is absolutely extraordinary right now. They're building a new science center. They became an international dark sky city recently. There's a really active group of people that is really into this and putting a whole bunch of things together. And when I contacted them, they pointed right at Scott Adams and said, he's the guy for your program. And so Scott, welcome to the show. And I can't wait to see what you got. So.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rick. I appreciate your having me on this evening. Yeah, I'm also an amateur astronomer here in Fountain Hills, and as Rick said, we're an international dark sky community. So one of my side gigs is actually leading the Fountain Hills Dark Sky Association, and we're a volunteer organization that work to reduce the impact of artificial light at night. But I got interested in astrophotography a couple of years ago after doing amateur astronomy for about 3 years. I realized a couple of years ago that photographs of the Milky Way can bring out a whole lot more detail than you can possibly see with your naked eye. And that was intriguing to me. So I started experimenting with it. And then I realized this whole thing with photographing the night sky is a good way to combine one of my daytime hobbies, which is photography, with a nighttime hobby. So here I am.
There you go. This is it. It's perfect. It's a perfect match. Yeah.
So Alicia, I think you're advancing my slides. We can go to number 2. Thank you. Thus far, I've been concentrating on photographing mostly the Milky Way and star trails, and you've seen many of those this evening as well. But they're great subjects, and I really like doing them. So that's what I'm showing here on this slide. Next slide, then. So this evening, I'm going to talk about the main equipment that I use, and also about some of the techniques that I use to capture and process these astrophoto landscape images. And as I said, I'm not an expert. I'm still learning. I'm going to be showing you some things that have worked for me. But as you've also seen earlier, the first 3 talks, there are lots of very, very good and very effective approaches to this. Next, please. Okay, so everybody's seen this also. The equipment that I use is very consistent with what the earlier speakers have used. I use a digital camera. I prefer a full frame camera because they're a little bit better at controlling noise and they give you a slightly wider field of view. You can use almost any wide angle lens you want. I use 14 and a zoom that goes from 18 to 35, but I found the range from 12 to 28 is a pretty effective range to use when you're shooting things like the Milky Way or star trails. Everybody's agreeing, we're all in agreement. You have to have a sturdy tripod. You can use a ball head or you can use a pan tilt head. And when you want to do what I call the composite Milky Way images, and I'm just going to distinguish that. When I say composite, Greg means blended, but all of my images tonight are, in Greg's terms, blended Milky Way images, but you have to have a star tracker for those, and I'll get into that. And then also the intervalometer is a very helpful tool to use, but it's not extremely essential. Okay, next slide, please. So what I'm trying to achieve with one of these Milky Way photos is to have a detailed sky over some kind of an interesting foreground. And, you know, it's not always possible to find the most interesting foreground, but the best images that I've come up with are a composite or a blend of a tracked sky image, which then has a blurred foreground merged with a static foreground image that of course has the blurred sky. But when you blend or merge those 2 images, you get the result of a sharp sky and a sharp foreground that I'm showing here on this slide. Next, please. And then when I do star trails, my objective is to just capture lots of very distinct star trails over an interesting foreground. And as previous speakers have said, no star tracker required, just a simple equipment camera on a fixed tripod. Next, please. So this is a comparison that I wanted to show between a single image on the left and one of these blended or composite images on the right. So the single image on the left is untracked. The camera's just sitting on a static tripod. And in that, when you're doing that, generally you're going to shoot in the 10 to 30 second range according to the 500 rule or the 400 or the 300 rule. But you will have to raise your ISO pretty high since you're only picking up a few seconds of exposure time. And this is not a stack, it's just a single image. And so as a result, you don't get as much detail in the Milky Way and you get lower contrast. But it's still a nice, nice colorful picture. On the right, this is one of the blended or composite images. So now I've got the camera on a star tracker, and I took several sky shots from the tracker, and then I took several foreground shots from a static tripod, and each of those then I stack. So I've got several images that go into the sky stack, several more into the foreground stack. Then I merge the sky with the foreground, and that because I have these stacks, I get less noise, and you can shoot with a lower ISO because you're shooting longer exposures, and that brings out greater contrast and greater detail in the Milky Way. Next. So here are some of my camera settings. Usually when I am out in the field, I shoot the foreground first during what I call late twilight, a little bit before maximum darkness. And you can put your camera on a fixed tripod, or what I usually do is I just have it on my tracker, but I don't have the tracker turned on. so it's static. And I'll shoot somewhere between 4 and 8 exposures of the foreground that I stack. And each of those exposures may be 30 to, depending on how much ambient light there is. And then if it's really hot outside, I have to manage the time between the exposures, and that's where the intervalometer helps also. But maybe 30 seconds to let that sensor cool down if it's really hot. Noise, long exposure noise reduction I have on to help remove some of the noise. And I found that apertures in the f3.5 to 4.5 range are pretty effective. Matrix metering, and I pick an ISO between 100 and 1000, depending on the ambient light. And I watch the histogram on the back of the camera, on the LCD display on the back of the camera to pick the ISO that I want. And then I focus close to infinity, but sometimes if you have something in the immediate foreground, you might want to back off from infinity just a little bit. Okay, next, please. So for the sky images, I'm also using a Sky Watcher Star Adventure tracker, just like Greg. Love it. And I shoot that after the foreground. And the important thing that I do is I tilt the camera back just a little bit and aim just a little bit higher in the sky. And I'll show you in another slide in a minute or two why I do that. So I'll shoot light frames, 4 to 8 exposures to stack. And those are going to be a lot longer, though, than the static shots. They're going to be 3 to 4 minutes each. And again, allow a few seconds between the exposures to keep the sensor as cool as possible. I don't shoot dark frames. That's a dark frame is when you just put the lens cap on and take a picture of nothing but darkness, and it captures the noise profile of your sensor. But these are not really ultra long exposures like a serious astrophotographer would do shooting a galaxy or a nebula. So I don't shoot dark frames. Aperture of 3.5 to 4.5 is a good range. I've tried shooting wider, like down to f2.8, and that starts to introduce coma distortion in the stars in the corners of the frame. So I try to avoid that. Matrix metering again, ISO in the range of 200 to 1600. If I can stay below 1600, I sure do try to do that to minimize noise. And I do focus the sky absolutely on infinity, but it may not be on your on your lens, the extreme focus ring position. I use a Batinov mask on one of my lenses, which is a mask that helps me know that I'm exactly on correct infinity focus, or the other of my lens doesn't accommodate a Batinov mask, so I use the magnifier on the back of the camera with a small loop magnifying glass to check that infinity focus. And long exposure noise reduction is turned off for these sky pictures. Okay, next, please. So the star trails, as I've said, and others have said, are done from a conventional tripod. They're just static exposures. You take several long exposures, and I generally take 1 to 3 hours total, just because that's about how much patience I have. You can go a lot longer than that. Okay, next, please.
Has to be nighttime though, right?
Yeah, most definitely. It's good to do that at night.
I guess I'm saying you're limited to at least 8 hours or so.
Yeah. I mostly shoot somewhere between 10 and 20 exposures for 1.5, 3 hours total exposure time, and shutter at 8 minutes or 10 minutes each, with a few seconds between, just to let that sensor cool a little bit. ISO 100 though, because since you are taking such long exposures, now you can move the ISO way down and eliminate a lot of noise. Again, f4 seemed like a pretty effective aperture to use. But if you do have something very, very close in the foreground, then you might have to close it down a little bit and use a smaller aperture. And again, matrix metering. Okay, next, please. So just a little bit on my processing. I do a slight pre-processing of all these raw images in Camera Raw, which is essentially the same as Lightroom. And then I go into a stacking program for the sky. I use Deep Sky Stacker, but Secretor is an extremely good program as well, and many, many people use that. For the foreground and star trails, I do all my processing and stacking in Photoshop. And then when I merge the foreground and the sky, I also use Photoshop. And this year, Photoshop introduced a new sky replacement tool that I've tried once. And so I'm not real familiar with it. It worked the time that I tried it. But what I've been doing is a process called Luminosity Masking. There's a free software called Easy Panel. And there's something that I paid for called Raya Pro that are both very, very good for luminosity masking to mask off that blurry sky and expose the sharp sky. And there are lots of YouTube videos on this. It's fairly complex procedure to go through. It took me a while to learn it, but Peter Zelenka is an excellent landscape astrophotographer, also becoming an excellent telescope astrophotographer, and he's got a lot of very, very good videos on YouTube. And then post-processing, I go back into Camera Raw and Photoshop to finish up my image. So just a little bit more now on this sky and foreground merging, because it's so critical. On the left, there's an image that is a stack of 3 frames that I stacked in Photoshop that have a sharp foreground because the camera was not moving, but you can see how badly blurred the sky is. And then on the right is when I had the camera on the star tracker and it was tracking the sky, so beautiful sharp Milky Way and a terrible looking blurry foreground. And the reason I tilt that camera back is that when I blend these 2 photos, I don't want that blurry foreground on the right to show up at all in the merged photo. So I make it smaller by tilting the camera back. And then when I merge these 2 photos, that blurred foreground is covered up by the nice sharp foreground, and I mask off the blurry sky to expose the nice sharp Milky Way. So that's what's behind that. Okay, next slide, please. So yeah, there's my merge composite of that same scene. So you can see the sharp sky, Jupiter and Saturn, they're rising just above the horizon, right of center, and the desert. This isn't my favorite foreground, but the particular night I was shooting that, I had a mountain in mind east of Phoenix, and there was a big fire and the smoke completely obscured the mountain. So like Dennis said, I made lemonade from, was it Dennis? Maybe it was Craig, I don't remember. Make lemonade. I drove 25 miles further south towards Tucson, and I found this very, very dark desert location, and so I made some lemonade. Okay, next slide, please. So I'll make some general observations too, just from my experience. Look for interesting foregrounds because they really help make a better image. And you can use Google Earth to do some pre-planning of your foreground options. Look for possible obstructions. You have to know where the Milky Way is going to be in the sky before you head out into the field, and you can use a planisphere or the PhotoPills app on your cell phone or a computer program called Stellarium. All of those are very effective for gleaning where the Milky Way is going to be at a certain time. If you want to capture the galactic center, you have to face the right direction, of course, at the right time. And that's a challenge. Living up here in the northeast corner of the Phoenix area, I can do it in May by pointing southeast, but now here in July, it's due south. And I have to shoot over Mesa and Chandler and those areas. So that's not really a possibility for me shooting from here. Another point, high ISO does not mean greater light exposure. You have to actually take longer exposures, longer shutter time. That brings more light in. That's what reduces the noise in your photographs. When you're tracking, be sure to align your tracker carefully with Polaris before you start shooting. I've made that mistake more than once. And for your tracked Milky Way shots, as I showed, it's good to tilt the camera upward a little bit to minimize the amount of that blurred foreground. It makes blending a lot easier. And then the other point that I'll make on blending is that merging that sky and foreground is much easier if the horizon is smooth. And what I mean by smooth simply means that if you have trees or bushes that are sticking up above the horizon, those things are really hard to blend. And so I always try to find a foreground that doesn't have that. It can be undulating, but that's all. Then this isn't a landscape picture, but this is on June 24th when we had our last supermoon of the year, and I was out with my telescope on a tracking mount photographing the moon. And I live 10 miles north of the final approach to Sky Harbor Airport, and a plane came by, and I was just lucky to be able to time the shot with the plane right in front of the moon. So what I did here is I stacked 250 frames of the moon to reduce atmospheric turbulence. And then I layered on top that one single frame that captured the jet. And when I did that, I lost the heat trails that had been behind the jet in that single frame. So I sort of faked those with a Gaussian blur. And if you look carefully, you can see that that blurred area behind the plane, just to make it look a little more realistic.
It actually, I was wondering how you got. I was stunned by the clarity of the moon, but that answer, I mean, 250.
The clarity
frames.
is because I took the 250 frames.
It's a lot of frames. That's
carefully processed.
It's beautiful. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, I think that's all I have. We can go. Yeah. So thanks for listening. I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit about Milky Way and star trail photography from all of us. And it's been fun being here, and thanks for having us.
Scott, this is great. And I really appreciate it. I think I said it before we actually started when we were kind of talking amongst ourselves, is all of you bring something to the table in your presentations. And so I think somebody could actually watch this YouTube video if they wanted to, or I mean, we've recorded this and watch it. And just, you know, we've given you a lot of insight into landscape astrophotography. And I think an audience could, like, you know, kind of take pieces of all of this, learn some of the detail from you about the settings and all that stuff, and some ideas from Greg and others. And I think this is really super cool. So thank you. So I'm going to invite Alex to the team right now. I'm going to just go right to him because he's been searching for questions from the audience. We're going to keep going, folks. So I know there's a lot of new people here today. And yes, we don't normally go way after 8 o'clock, but we still have some things to work on. So we're going to launch a little poll for you. Alex is going to kind of like see if there's some questions for the team and some of our presenters, and we'll see where we go from here. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Rick. The first question we have actually comes from Michael, and he's wondering, why do you stack the still shots of the foreground? What does that buy you? What does it add to the image, you know? So not just the stars, but why have that foreground element in the photos?
Yeah, so who wants to take that one real quick? We're just stacking, and when did stacking start? Why did we used to stack 20 years ago, or when is this new?
I can take that. At least from my perspective, stacking anywhere from 3 to 6 foreground images does greatly reduce the noise, because you are shooting the foreground at an elevated ISO. You know, you might be 1,000 or something like that, and you're still doing 30-second exposures. So there's noise there, digital noise, and stacking reduces that considerably.
Stacking happens because there's software that actually is developed to do this, right? Nobody is stacking themselves, right? You load a bunch of images, and this thing processes, and it sort of like aligns everything, and then cleans the noise and gives you that, right?
That's right.
Okay. All right. Good.
When you stack, the signal is not random, and so that comes through, but the noise is random. The digital noise is random. So when you add a bunch of frames together, that random noise tends to cancel.
Excellent. Okay. All right. Thanks. Any more, Alex?
We have one from Terrence who asked if any of you have ever photographed the moving rocks. That's an interesting question.
Oh, is this in the Atacama Desert? Is that? Well,
I
guess I
believe
can't.
that's
Yeah.
probably what it's referring to, probably.
Interesting. Yeah, yeah. No, I think all of this. I think these, because these guys are all sort of like from Arizona. I noticed from your images, almost everything was the Southwest, except for I think there was a Mount Rainier in there a little bit, and an Oregon coast, if I remember right. But almost all of this, and I still chuckle that all of you are going to the same places. I didn't expect that. I mean, how many people saw the tower at the Grand Canyon? And anyway, so we're all doing the same
There is
thing.
a place called the
Yeah.
Racetrack. The Racetrack is in Death Valley National Park, and there's rocks on that track.
Okay.
I mean, I've been there and shot that.
Oh, you did. Oh, so you did. I do have images. And so, is this multi-days? I mean, do you have to do this over weeks, or are these things moving that fast?
No, they're just, if you Google this, the Racetrack, they're just rocks sitting on a mud flat plain.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a track behind the rocks that looks like they've moved, and they haven't. So a lot of people go there to take pictures of these rocks. They're not actually moving before your eyes.
Okay, good. I just sorry, I just didn't. I sort of half knew the reference. So hey, we've closed the poll. Who wants to sort of share the results?
I can. Hello. So our first question is, where are we viewing from? And 72% of us are viewing from Arizona.
Okay.
And our second question was, how many people are viewing this presentation with you? And 74% of us said just me. And I'm right there with you all. So
This is a question that came up because we've heard that other people kind of getting together as groups, and maybe this is an encouraging. If you like what you saw tonight, and you sort of like think this is kind of cool, then kind of turn it into a little party. I know we have one group at Mirabella, which is a kind of a new residence facility near campus, and I think they watch together. So welcome if you are. We also got the word out tonight to a whole bunch of different astrophotography clubs. Astronomy clubs: the East Valley Astronomy Association, the Fountain Hills Astronomy people, the Phoenix Astronomical Society, and then Kevin, what was the other one? There's a new group I'd never even heard of before. What is it? And you guys can close the poll. Oh, I guess everybody has to turn it off their own screen. Okay.
Yeah, so I give two shout outs. One is, it's called Arizona Night Photographers. So they definitely specialize in more of the night photography. And I just wanted to say that, interestingly enough, or applicable to our discussion tonight, is that Arizona Highways magazine every week has this Friday photos where you can post photos and maybe they'll share them. And this week's theme is actually nighttime. So there's a ton of great photos I've witnessed even today.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll take a look. That's really super cool. Well, and one of the reasons to do this is because people travel in the summer. If you're out sort of like moving around and seeing the amazing landscapes in the Southwest, the canyons, the cliffs, and all of that kind of stuff, I thought this would sort of like bring some of that home. And because this is a good time to do this. Maybe we'll make this kind of annual. So to do something like this every year at the middle of the summer, it's a good way to do it. Any more questions for the group, guys? We could just a couple of things we wanted to just tell the audience about some activities going on that is not landscape astrophotography, but I'll let Alex kind of call the shot. Do we have any more questions to take, or can we move on?
Just a lot of compliments and thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. Well, for everybody that sort of joined us, Greg, Kevin, Dennis, and Scott, I just really, really appreciate you guys coming to the table. And some of you kind of have done this before. Some of you put a lot of work into kind of the program for tonight. But I couldn't have asked for a better sort of just range of presentations and just a wonderful introduction to this thing. And what I think comes out of this is all four of you have a passion for what you're doing. I guess you got to really, really think you you got to love this. You got to, because you're driving a long way, or you're staying out all night, or you're out in the cold a lot, and so there's something going on that sort of makes you want to do this, and with all the toil and trouble and that goes along, and so I really appreciate you sharing your passion and what you do, and it's just been great to have you on the program tonight. Thank you guys. Thank you all.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
You're welcome, guys. And so I wanted to just sort of just move to the next thing, and would that be Alicia?
That's gonna be Alex.
Yeah.
Oh,
that
I'm
would
sorry,
be
Alex.
me.
Back to Alex. Okay.
Yeah,
sorry.
so we're going to talk about something that ASU's been involved in that just had a pretty huge milestone, a mission that ASU's been involved in. LunaMap. LunaMap is a spacecraft that has been in design and being built at ASU for a very long time at some of our facilities, and just recently it was actually delivered to NASA Kennedy Space Center. So now it's going to be prepared and tested and then eventually put on a rocket and launched. But this was a process 7 years in the making. The spacecraft is going to be orbiting our moon, specifically studying the poles and looking for hydrogen, and more specifically kind of off of hydrogen looking for water. So that hydrogen mapper will be able to look for maybe future sources of fuel if we ever decide to put rockets launching from the moon, and also water as well. So you can see there's the team, and that is the spacecraft.
There it is. It's like it's in a suitcase.
And actually here it is on transport. They bought a seat for it on a plane and they brought it along with them. So that's how small this thing is, although, you know, it's still incredibly important. It'll be able to do great science. Let me share a video real quick. Make sure that everyone can see that.
The spacecraft itself is only about 30 pounds, and it's about the size of a Costco cereal box. I'm Joe Dubois. I'm the lead mechanical engineer on LunaMap. It's a spacecraft going to the moon in search of water.
The other day we were lifting the spacecraft. You know, we just pick it up and put it in the thermal chamber and take it out. We wheel it on a cart across the room. My name's Craig Hardgrove. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Earth and Space Exploration, and I'm the principal investigator of the LunaMap mission.
So you might be wondering, how do we search for water without landing on the moon? It's quite fascinating. We have to look for neutrons, and neutrons aren't coming from the water itself, but they're getting knocked off by cosmic rays. And that's some pretty deep science. But more or less what we know is that when we fly over, with the presence of these neutrons, we can safely say that there's hydrogen, which means there's water.
We know we need water either as fuel or to support people because, you know, it's expensive to launch stuff off of the Earth. So if there are resources on the moon that we could harness either to go to Mars or to support some base on the moon, then it would be valuable to know how much there is and exactly where it is.
Excellent.
And then here's another picture from the team. Here's I believe this is Chris Hardgrove, and there's a part of the spacecraft with signatures from all the team members on it. Very neat to see, and so very, very exciting. And so that's LunaMap. Another thing we have is, I'll share it real quick. So this is the Hopper, I believe, is what it's called. So this is a partnership that Arizona State University has with Intuitive Machines on a mini extreme mobility lunar vehicle called Micronova. And this will basically, instead of roving, it'll bounce around the surface of the moon and take the first ever pictures inside the craters close to the lunar South Pole. So kind of where LunaMap is looking, this thing will be bouncing around and looking. And so the mission science lead and actually our own School of Earth and Space Exploration Professor Mark Robinson and his team will be designing and building this. So another very exciting mission here at ASU that we're all very proud of and excited for.
Something to talk about. It's absolutely amazing. And I've been watching the team put together the LunaMap, and it's right inside the windows, and you can just kind of like sort of watch all that activity. But I just chuckle every time I sort of think of this thing sitting in a seat of an airplane or an airline. It's basically American Airlines, and they just like flew it to Florida. So I think that's really super cool. So Alicia, if you go.
Yes, thank you so much, Alex. And now I'm going to share our resource of the week. Alex and I have switched roles. And so we just talked to you about hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of cameras and telescopes. We've also talked to you about millions of dollars worth of space hardware and equipment. And now I'm going to talk to you about an item hopefully you have in your home, or a majority of us probably have in our phone, or in our home, and that's our cell phone. And so the reason why this is our resource of the week is because you can actually use your cell phone if you have one of the newer models. You can use your cell phone for astrophotography. And so we have some examples here. So the photos that were taken by Jamie Carter were taken on an iPhone 11 Pro. So there wasn't a telescope, there wasn't anything else used, it was just the camera. And same with Austin. Austin's photos were used using an iPhone 12 Pro. And so that just goes to show that technology is ever changing, ever increasing, and getting better every time. And so the phones that are capable now to take these sorts of high resolution images that you might have would be the iPhone 11 Pro and up or newer, the Samsung Galaxy S20 Ultra 5G and newer, or later models, I should say, the Google Pixel 4 XL and later. And then there are a couple other less popular brands that you can check and see if your models work with. And if you have an older phone, don't be discouraged. There are lots of apps on your app store that you can look at, astrophotography apps that are free to help change your exposure and your f-stop and things like that. So make sure that you check out the resources on your phone. Make sure you Google or just do a little more research and see what your phone is capable of doing, and maybe you can take some incredible photos too. With that being said, I'm going to pass things back to Rick, and he's going to close out our show, I believe.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think that the message there is we didn't want to just show you a whole bunch of amazing astrophotography from these from the amateur astronomers that we met tonight, because and just think you have to get into a huge amount of investment of a bunch of equipment. And there's ways to kind of experiment with what you have. And I'm going to say it again: is a year from now everything's going to be different, and it'll just be easier and even less expensive. So if you're interested in doing this on a vacation, or you want to kind of try this, that would be great. I wanted to talk just very briefly just about what we're going to do next, not next Wednesday. We do this every 2 weeks. So the next session that we'll have will be the peak of the Perseid meteor shower. So here it comes. You saw one of the images we saw tonight was the Perseids. It is the easiest one to see from a big community like ours. So even in Phoenix, you should see some meteors if you can get out into the night sky. But this one is well positioned. So they come around the same time of year, but the moon changes behavior every year. This particular time, remember we had a full moon about 3-4 days ago. So it's now waning. It'll get smaller and smaller. We'll go through a new moon phase about 4 days before the Perseid peak, but the Perseids actually last several weeks. So what I'm encouraging is between thunderstorms and between sort of monsoon things, if there is a clear night, especially later in the night, especially even early in the morning, 1 or 2 in the morning, if there's a clear sky, this is a great year to take advantage of that. Go on, just kind of try to check it out. Be outside for about 30 seconds or 30 minutes to sort of let your eyes kind of calm. And I suspect you're probably going to see something. This is a good year for the Perseids. We will talk a lot more about them at the program in 2 weeks, because that really is the days where the Perseids are peaking as they're reaching their maximum. We'll talk a little bit about the new moon, and we're trying to get an update for you from the Perseverance rover and cameras that ASU operates on Mars. We think it's time to sort of show you some of the photography that we're getting from another planet. And so that's all in 2 weeks. And 1 month from now, I'll give you a little teaser. We have a program at ASU called Interplanetary Initiative, and it's a pan-university program. It was originated by Dr. Crow, the president of the university, and Lindy Elkins-Tanton, who is a principal investigator of a space mission that is embedded in our school, the School of Earth and Space Exploration. And they have a new director, and we've invited the director to come on just to explain what Interplanetary Initiative is, what they're trying to do, how that works, how people might be able to get involved in that particular program. And it's really deep, it's really intellectual, it's really sort of mind-blowing, some of the things that they're working on. And we're going to have a little presentation about that. And so there's a couple of things that we've been highlighting all along. Kim and I are going to be out at Boyce Thompson Arboretum at the end of August. So that's on August 28th. And so that's going to be believe it or not, my first live star presentation, star show that I've done since COVID. So I'm going to get out from behind the camera and out from my Zoom, and we're actually going to be out at Boyce Thompson Arboretum in a month, and we're going to actually sort of have our laser pointers, and we're going to have a really good night sky presentation. So we look forward to that. It's not far out of Phoenix. If you've never been there, it's only about a 30-minute drive from the East Valley, and it's great. It's dark skies, and it'll be a great presentation. I think that's where I'm going to kind of leave it. Thank you very much for hanging in there till the very end. We don't usually go this long, but had great presenters tonight. We wanted to give everybody time to have their say and do their program. And so for those of you that are joining us for the first time tonight, make sure you kind of keep track of what we're doing. We're usually a little bit tighter to an hour, and it is every other Wednesday. We're just going to keep going until we lose interest, which I think is years and years and years from now. We've got a lot to talk about, and we'll try to come up with an engaging program every single other week. So thanks for coming, and thanks to my team for putting this great show together, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks, you guys. Bye-bye.